Hello and welcome to the Innovation Talk series in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University. My name is Katina Michael. I'm a professor in SFIS, and today I bring to you a wonderful meeting of minds. I'm hosting a session that I'm very proud to host, and it's leading edge thought really from experts around the world. But today we've chosen someone who's visiting at SFIS as a professor from the University of Wollongong. And it would be an honor to open this meeting with a few words from our director in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society, Kathleen Vogel. Over to you, Kathleen.
Thank you so much, Katina. And good morning, good afternoon, whatever time zone you might be in right now. I'm so glad to have you all here today. So I'm very excited to be able to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Roba Abbas, who is a senior lecturer in operations and systems and is also the academic program director with the Faculty of Business and Law at the University of Wollongong in Australia. We are also very excited to have her as a visiting professor with our school, the Future of Innovation Society, this semester. She is also co-editor of the IEEE Transactions on Technology and Society and former associate editor of the IEEE Technology and Society magazine. Roba has a PhD in location-based services regulation and industry experience in web design and development. She primarily researches methodological approaches to complex socio-technical systems design, emphasizing transdisciplinarity, co-design, and the intersection of science, technology, ethics, and regulation. Roba has received grants for research addressing global challenges in areas such as robotics, social media, and other emerging technologies using approaches in socio-technical systems and operations management. She has appeared on international panels, delivered talks, and co-organized events for Yale University, the Alan Turing Institute, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Association of Geographers, among others. We are so happy to have you here today. Welcome, Roba.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Kathleen, and my gratitude also to Katina and Melissa for hosting this event and for everyone at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society for the opportunity to speak today. As part of this session, I'll be sharing some of our work on the theme of public interest technology, looking specifically at an open socio-technical ecosystems perspective through the presentation of an emergent framework. And I'll define each of those concepts in a moment. When approaching presentations of this nature that relate to systems design in general, so your complex socio-technical systems, things such as values, governance, innovation, ethics, and society, and so many other concepts that necessitate consideration of your multifaceted, context-specific and evolving concepts and structures, I've increasingly found it useful to select one specific thread and just run with that single strand during a given presentation rather than attempting to capture everything. And that, in effect, is my disclaimer for not attempting comprehensive coverage of our socio-technical framework for public interest technology. So the thread for today that I've selected and where I'll begin my presentation is concerned with how we envisage our relationship with technology and the impact that that position may have on socio-technical systems design and serving the public interest more specifically. And let's briefly look at a few images that demonstrate this point. So here we have a range of pictures that depict technology in different ways and across a range of settings. As you're viewing the images, you might be drawn to a particular one. So perhaps you see a current application of technology that you research, connect with, utilize, or feel strongly about. Maybe you're even contemplating a future state that either appeals to you or concerns you, or perhaps that you feel divided about. As you consider your response or responses to these images, I'll quickly run through them and share some preliminary thoughts about each and possible interpretations that essentially reflect a diversity of perspectives on technology. So the first to me depicts artificial intelligence, technological potential, techno-optimism, a view essentially that technology can be harnessed in a positive way and that innovation is about shiny gadgets and solutions. The second is also quite technically focused. The next, arguably, is less technocentric. So here we're seeing icons of people, goals, targets, devices, and our global community represented by the map in the background. Now we have perhaps a future mode or a future mode of operation. And I think immediately to ideas of human-robot interaction, job displacement, and have a mixed response to this image actually. So maybe we're veering more towards a critical view of technological advancements, more conflicted view perhaps, but maybe not. And lastly, a dystopian view where technology is considered a source of suffering and injustice. And here you can clearly see the fallout depicted in this image. So in the context of this presentation, what does all of this mean about how we approach design of socio-technical systems in the public interest, when evidently the perspectives and positions on technology can differ so drastically, existing on a continuum essentially between techno-optimism and techno-pessimism? And before I attempt to address that specific question, we can derive additional detail from those images if we look carefully, things to do with application, with context, perhaps with implications, and also the idea of scale. And on that latter point, my colleague from the University of Wollongong, Dr. Albert Munoz, and I discussed the idea of scale in addition to system dynamics and a model for how systems can leverage uncertainty for gains in a recent paper, which is shown on your screen. We essentially explored risk and systems fragility in the context of big data and information systems that are embedded within a broader socio-technical system, and the conceptual systems, in fact, and the conceptual artifact for designing anti-fragile socio-technical systems is what is shown on your slide. And while I won't go through that in detail, a few insights from our work that contribute to the framing for today's discussion of socio-technical systems and public interest technology will be drawn out. And these include and apply beyond the information systems domain that was the focus of this paper. They include the initial point about the nature of systems design and development methodologies in view of their inability to account for scenarios beyond narrowly defined use cases that don't necessarily accommodate and account for the complex socio-technical landscape of today. The result, in fact, is that increased levels of uncertainty will permeate these systems due to their scale and the tight coupling of components, and much has been written about tight coupling and so on. These and other related factors and characteristics, if you will, of socio-technical systems leave them open to ethical and other breaches to the detriment of both people and planet. And this inevitably introduces this uncertainty and exposure to uncertainty results in systems failures. However, we may define those failures that affect people, processes, supply chains, the environment, and so on. And they exist across a spectrum also in terms of their effects. So you have minor through to those that are catastrophic in nature. Some of these sources of failure may have been identified or anticipated with suitable risk assessment and management processes introduced in response, while others are often unanticipated. So back to the question about how we may approach design in a complex environment. What this background I've presented essentially demonstrates, among other things, is that socio-technical systems design efforts require consideration of a range of perspectives, positions, and interests, which are often conflicting and incompatible. They can be professional interests and expertise that need to be tempered with the lived experience of individuals and of society, individuals within society. And we design within, and to borrow some of the words of Professor Joseph Cavalco, who was a guest at our Public Interest Technology Colloquium this week, in the words of Joe, they exist within complex, dynamic environments. And what I think is quite interesting that Joe mentioned is that some of these systems have the potential to damage human interests. And with that background and introduction, I'll launch straight into the outline for the remainder of this presentation, where my intention really is to define and discuss some of those concepts that I mentioned so far, and offer a potential framework for connecting ideas of public interest technology with socio-technical design and ecosystems, again, within the context of that disclaimer that I issued earlier on. In doing so, I'll be providing a brief overview of how we define and perceive public interest technology beyond traditional definitions, thereby representing an emergent framework. I'll also be emphasizing the importance of socio-technical theory to this framework and to designing in a way that serves the public interest, after which I'll discuss operationalization of the framework through a range of projects. Depending on time, I'll probably cover about 2 or 3 projects. And the end of the presentation will be more about the questions that this assessment and investigation has resulted in that need to be addressed. And these questions essentially point to our team's future research trajectory. And speaking of the team, I would like to acknowledge our team leading several projects related to socio-technical co-design and public interest technology. We have Professor Katina Michael, who specializes in information technology, engineering, and law, as some of you are probably aware, and currently at Arizona State University. Associate Professor M.G. Michael, with expertise in philosophy, theology, and history, formerly at the University of Wollongong. We have Associate Professor Rob Nichols from the University of New South Wales, Sydney, whose research is at the intersection of Rob does quite a lot at the intersection of regulation, technology, and engineering, essentially, and Professor Jeremy Pitt from Imperial College London, who has expertise, among other things, in intelligent and self-organizing systems and artificial intelligence. And I will be drawing on some insights about work that has been completed with other colleagues, such as Eusebio Skonavaka, Jason Sargent, Nalini and Netra Chetri, Salah Hamdoun, Jumana Ghazaleh, and others. So I'd like to recognize their contribution too. In terms of public interest technology, some of you here might be aware of what public technology is in terms of its core principles, the notions of stakeholder engagement, ideas around access, equity, unintended consequences, and the social implications of technology. I will be presenting today the notion of public interest technology as both a framework for complex socio-technical ecosystems design, as well as an outcome of the design process. And that's what's represented here on the screen. And I do recognize there are quite a few elements, and I will hone in on select elements in a moment. So what this framework essentially represents is how we progress from the technological landscape and the underlying developments in technology that exist within the context of the regulatory and legal setting within a particular context, right through to application areas across things such as education, commerce, media, utilities, housing and other healthcare, housing and other. And then we sort of progress to this idea of financing that can come from either public entities, private entities, or it could be in the context of public to private partnerships. But what I will be focusing on today is a subset of this particular framework in the interest of time, and that's what's highlighted, should be highlighted here on your screen, from the actual theorization and conceptualization within the public interest technology framework. So how we think about theory, embedding theory within that framework, looking to previous cases, perhaps those that are successful and unsuccessful. My emphasis, as per the title of the talk, will be on that theoretical layer, but more importantly, how that theory allows us to operationalize in a way to achieve that goal of public interest technology. So it's almost like using that term in to imply two meanings, as I said, the goal and the philosophy itself. So in the interest of time, as I said, the select elements of this framework, namely theorization and operationalization through a socio-technical approach, will allow us to move on to some sample projects to see how this process or this framework has been applied in practice. So you could probably see under theorization and conceptualization here and operationalization that the term socio-technical appears in several places. And it's one of my favorite topics to talk about because it does many things, but namely allows us for a rich discussion and conceptualization of system interactions and dynamics, and a possible means of both, as I mentioned earlier, representing public interest technology or PIT as a philosophy, but also achieving public interest technology as the intended outcome. I won't be going into this in great detail, except to denote two really important points about socio-technical theory in terms of providing an overview. The first is, and I think this is a really important one, the first is that socio-technical can denote really anything that has a social and a technical element that are integrated in a particular kind of way, or they interact in a particular way. But it may also be used in reference to a theory, and the latter is what we are referring to here as integrated or embedded within that public interest technology framework. Essentially, and by way of a succinct summary, socio-technical theory emerged in the late 1950s in response to technological determinism, and is essentially it provided a new paradigm for designing, redesigning, or introducing some kind of intervention within the context of a primary work system within the organization. And as you can see on your slide here, there was the old paradigm at the time that favored the technological imperative that viewed man as extension of the machine, as an expendable spare part, perhaps. The organizational structure was quite autocratic. Things were centered around competition and a low risk taking as opposed to an innovative environment. Now, the so-called new paradigm that emerged at the time and became more and more established towards the 80s and was adopted in a range of different contexts is what is the socio-technical paradigm based on socio-technical theory. Instead of thinking about the technological imperative and the promotion of technology as the important component within a particular system, it was all about joint optimization. Instead of man being an expendable part, an extension to machine, it was about that complementarity, about a resource to be harnessed and developed, about more of a focus on those social elements. The organizational structure that was promoted, and this is a key part here, is around the flat organizational chart. And I will return to that in a moment in view of operationalization. So things were all driven towards, in this new paradigm, a participative style where collaboration, collegiality, increased commitment, and higher degree of risk taking around innovation was promoted. Now, I will stop here, but I will also mention that this theory, particularly as we went through into the 70s, was about design, essentially. So designing a work system, designing perhaps a department, an organization, issuing an intervention of some kind. And with that came some challenges, and some of those challenges we're working on moving beyond now in terms of theoretical extension and so on. But most of those challenges, or a great deal of them at the time, were in reference to the designer's frame of reference. So the designers had a particular frame of reference that they used to work within that resulted in faulty design choices. And we're back to that notion that I started off with in terms of complex systems around failures to better perceive design alternatives, or to provide design alternatives that actually serve people. And this is why this is quite an important theoretical lens to apply on public interest technology, because socio-technical theory encouraged, in addition to a range of things, the idea of moving beyond these faulty design choices that resulted in bad design, causing behavioral and other issues. And this was in the context of management information systems here. And that's pretty much a diluted discussion of this term or of this theory. A prominent representation, though, that I think is helpful in context here is that is presented on your screen, and you might have seen before. It's used quite a lot in the socio-technical space when referencing theory, and it's about how we segment the different areas within, or the different aspects, or as we call them, subsystems within the broader socio-technical system. So you have your social system or subsystem that involves structure and people and so on. Your technical subsystem, which is about technology and tasks, they interact within an environmental context, and that is how we represent our primary work systems. Now, I do want to mention that there are a range of other representations and ways that we can perceive socio-technical theory. This is just a prominent one. However, those representations might require some enhancement in line with current systems and the complex nature of those systems. Something I'd also like to mention in view of socio-technical theory is the idea of the idea of principles, so the core principles of the theory. And those principles are centered around two ideas. One is about how we capture the nature of interactions, and that's quite key to the public interest technology framework that we've proposed. So the nature of complex interactions between social and technical will determine the degree of success, however we define that success, that a system is likely to achieve. The second principle is that of joint optimization, which is often defined as a best match, a fit between components that are social and technical in nature, and later representations encompass the environmental subsystem as being a dimension within the theory that required that optimization effort also. Now, again, there are some challenges associated with joint optimization, with traditional socio-technical theory, and so on. But these principles that I mentioned are operationalized or need to be operationalized in a particular kind of way, and this is usually achieved through a process of socio-technical co-design, which requires, as per earlier and seminal socio-technical studies, such as that presented on your screen, requires intense collaboration. And that collaboration needs to be implemented or encouraged at multiple levels and through the employment of a multi-stakeholder perspective. And that includes encompassing both lived experience and professional expertise, as I alluded to earlier. And we feel that the existing socio-technical theory and associated methodologies to support the required engagement efforts need, as I mentioned, some kind of enhancement or extension. They also need to be embedded within that broader PIT framework I presented earlier, which is what our team is presently further developing. I won't go into the required enhancements and extensions, but rather I'll provide a number of examples, all of which promote that multi-level and stakeholder collaboration view as being key to the operationalization of both socio-technical theory and the public interest technology framework as a whole. The first will look at an application of the highlighted stages of the PIT framework. So those areas between theorization to operationalization and also implementation in practice. So that is that end-to-end process from theory to practice. The second, and I will mention the second and third just briefly in the interest of time, just to leave some time for questions. We'll look at socio-technical transitions built on that particular framework that was presented, our emergent paradigm, and applied more specifically to the context of technology and sustainability, emphasizing more specifically the theorization aspect. And the third will touch on, which sat beneath socio-technical co-design in the framework, the idea of the role that standards might play and how you might approach it from a socio-technical perspective. So in terms of the first example, this is a recent example in which Katina Michael, Jeremy Pitt, Rob Nichols, Matthew Mitka, and myself presented a scientific session to the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And this session was, I guess, geared towards demonstrating that emergent public interest technology paradigm that would embrace the value of democracy by design through socio-technical design for public interest technology, with an emphasis, as per the theme of this year's AAAS annual meeting, with an emphasis on evidence-based examples of an operationalized socio-technical system in practice. And as part of this particular scientific session, we were focused on providing individual presentations that can be merged together in a way to present a narrative around theory. So how we theorize when it comes to complex systems, also about operationalization and the role that different types of evidence will have. And finally, the role of value-based design and democracy by design in the development of sustainable systems. We followed up these individual presentations with a live session in which a number of themes emerged and were discussed. We spoke about the challenges in operationalizing socio-technical approaches and principles in the public interest. An emergent theme was also around the importance of qualitative evidence of stories, of different types of evidence to this process in capturing that lived experience. And also there was a thread around how we reconcile the lived experience with the professional expertise through a process of design. We also spoke about informing design through functional democratic governance, and emphasis on legitimacy. And something that's quite important and will be something that will flow through to the future research as part of this presentation is the role of academia, of transdisciplinarity and knowledge production, and how we work within that framework. So this is just a sample of what will be available shortly. We have our focus on a moderated session that went through to discussions of theory, of evidence and operationalization. We have Matthew Mitka in the bottom left-hand corner, who went through and provided us a walkthrough of a working system and how it might actually be implemented in practice. And we finished off with a discussion on sustainability and our live session, which you could probably just briefly see. That's a cyclical diagram that shows the public interest technology framework as it might be implemented in practice as an iterative process with values and sustainability at the core, and governance encompassing that entire process. The second example, and I will start to wrap up soon because I think I'm close to time here. The second example is more theoretical in nature. It was around the idea of presenting a contribution around the role of technology and information systems as tied to sustainability. And a way that we implemented that public interest technology framework was to look at the context of sustainability, large-scale systems, back to the notion of tight coupling, and see how we might engage in a socio-technical transition toward sustainability, which we defined as human health and environmental sustainability. So it was quite broad, and we spoke as part of that contribution, theoretically and conceptually, about the socio-technical co-design process, how we measure the effect of design and the different kinds of externalities, assessing impact on health, well-being and environmental sustainability, and also the importance of evaluation to this process and to others. And the third example is around technology standards. So in terms of technology standards and standardization, we have been involved in the development of the IEEE standard 2089, which is for an age-appropriate digital services framework based on 5 rights principles. And the idea is how we actually engage with design efforts centered on designing for children or designing with children in mind. I will park that thought for a moment and turn my attention to future research. And as I mentioned at the start of my presentation, future research is really about answering some additional questions that emerge as part of implementing the public interest technology framework across a range of settings. It's about who defines the socio-technical system's goals, and there needs to be some exploration and investigation around that. What values might be embedded in the system? So that's an entirely different conversation that's important within its own right. Who's involved in the design? So how we actually facilitate and execute that socio-technical co-design process. What does the technological landscape look like? And how does the regulatory landscape look like as well? What does it look like? How do we actually conceptualize that landscape in the context of a particular setting, a community, and so on, and how we deal with the pacing problem, for example, or address the pacing problem. And there are many other contextual factors which were represented on the sort of perimeter of that diagram. And finally, how we integrate the idea of the public interest and capture that by looking at reconciling the lived experience of individuals with professional expertise. And there are some great works that address or provide insights into some of these areas. So I encourage the reading of Jeremy Pitt's book, Joseph Cavalco's book, William DeBar's and Michael Crow's book. They all point to various facets and aspects within that framework, and I think give or provide us with pieces of the puzzle. And all of this needs to be achieved. My final point, and back to looking back where we started, all of this needs to be achieved with an appreciation of complexity and the complexity that is inherent in socio-technical ecosystems that are oriented towards serving the public interest. And I welcome any of your questions. Thank you so much for hosting me.
All right, well, Roba, thank you so much for your presentation. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. What I would like to ask is, the audience that, as Katina mentioned here, we'll have until around 4:30 here on Arizona time, time for Q&A. So that's about a good half hour. And then we're going to have a separate 30-minute sessions with the students. So if anyone has a question, I would invite you to either use the chat here or raise your hand. And I see Marcos has raised his hand here. So Marcos, please.
The point that I'd like to add to this is the complementary factor of governance. There's a critical element in societies in the loss of trust in both experts and expertise and in the structures that we have in order to implement many of the systems that Abbas was outlining. It's difficult to see how many of these studies could actually be implemented these days, given this rising tide of misinformation and distrust of the mechanisms. So I think complementary analysis of that side is equally important. And in fact, both sides are essential. I'd like to highlight that as it's a conclusion I've come to after quite some time thinking about it. I'm not sure if I picked on an appropriate question or not, but I'd be very interested in Abbas's response.
Thank you, Marcus. It's lovely to see you here today. So the question, just to reiterate, to make sure I'm understanding correctly, is that we need to think of the inverse view of what was presented in terms of the challenges of this approach with a particular reference to governance. Is that correct, Marcus?
Yes, and the mechanisms in society.
And the mechanisms in society. I think you're quite right there. As part of that AAAS example that we mentioned, Marcus, in the live session more particularly, we focused on the more critical view of this process. And you're quite right. And I think you're spot on in terms of the correct question to be asking, and they need to be quite critical of what was presented in view of the mechanisms in society, governance, the general mistrust, and trust emerges as a theme in all of the studies that we've completed across every single project. And Katina can second that. It's quite difficult because of the, original perceptions of socio-technical design. So there's the work that you'd be pretty familiar with, the work of Mumford, who reports on the successes and failures, why people are distrusting of not only the governance structures, Marcus, but also the industry-based mechanisms. And I guess what we're trying to show here is that there is a different model that we can work within that can be embedded within industry that is quite, receptive to those challenges, honest and transparent in terms of the processes and mechanisms. And I know these are quite aspirational targets and things we're trying to get to, but I'm in complete agreement about the need for that complementary analysis. I'd love to pick your brain further about that, and specifically given your background about multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity in addition to transdisciplinarity. As you're well aware, most of these multi-inter-transdisciplinary projects either implode, fail for a range of different reasons. And I think that's going to be the key to operationalization, to work out the model around transdisciplinarity, and also to be quite honest, just back to the AAAS example that I was referencing about the challenges. And as part of that live session, we covered some of the challenges specific to socio-technical co-design. There's things about power imbalances that need to be rectified. There are issues around and I think, Toby, you might have mentioned power and related topics in your colloquium talk, and you've been a champion for those kind of ideas. And you were quite right in that sense. So there's a power imbalance. There's also the idea of how we reconcile. And I touched on that point and sort of left that as part of my presentation in the interest of time. But how do we look at lived experience and integrate it with professional expertise in a way that works for the public? But I think, there are all of those challenges. Marcus, I'm interested in hearing if you're willing to share your thoughts about specifically the transdisciplinary aspects and what you see as being the major challenges, because you're a multidisciplinary scholar in every sense of the term, and you have an intimate understanding of what the challenges are. Maybe we can draw out some lessons from that and have that complementary analysis that you suggested, but not just around governance, around industry-based structures, around how we think about different forms of regulation, which I parked for this discussion because there's just so much to deal with, and I chose the thread of, or how do we perceive technology? But do you have any ready thoughts that you'd be willing to share about how you'd approach multidisciplinarity, given your experience and related to that topic in your question?
I've spent some time mentoring advanced PhD students in 12 different subjects. And what I discovered from these very bright people is it took them 6 months to realize that they were actually fairly expert at the 3rd or 4th year of a PhD, and then to stop talking past each other. That is a simple paradigm and a practical one for answering your question about transdisciplinarity. The second component is that as universities get under greater pressure, transdisciplinarity questions are less and less pleasant. I've actually been told that I'm not qualified for 2 PhDs in this area. I don't have the pre-qualifications. All I can say is that the people I tell that to try to keep a straight face. But it's serious. If you don't validate the links between disciplines by actually undertaking them, then you will ignore them and it will become irrelevant. For example, if you're trying to talk to a politician about how they use expert advice, you will find, as I did, quite disconcertingly, wild enthusiasm for you to pursue that study with any cooperation they can offer. I was speaking to a minister last week. I was bowled over by the enthusiasm. So framing questions that use a socio-technical approach and complement it with how you link it to political and governance structures and possibly even actions is an issue that requires fairly urgent research, and it's not just a single discipline. That's the shortest answer I can give you on air. I mean, I can obviously give longer ones offline.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. I all of those thoughts resonate with me. And you mentioned some important things about political and governance structures, also economics structures and how we think about techno-economic paradigms within a business context. I think will have a big role to play, Marcus. In terms of transdisciplinarity, I have many things to say on that point and how we encourage transdisciplinarity. I've been involved in a few funded multidisciplinary projects, and I'll just call them multidisciplinary projects for now. Can't claim transdisciplinarity, and the more successful ones have been the ones in which we have spent time, back to your first point, of not talking past each other and actually actively listening to establish, I guess, what we've been calling a common vocabulary for discussion. And that has taken 2 years to establish that initial discussion or that initial vocabulary. It takes time, and because of the pace of technological development, particularly when we're thinking about orienting our efforts towards a technological solution, we tend to do so in a speedy manner, and we don't think about these issues. Whereas it's been really enlightening looking at some of those projects that in which multidisciplinarity may work, and thinking about how, I guess, careful planning and deliberation, not talking past each other, the role of academic institutions, something you touched on, is very important. And in the past, I've worked across a range of different schools, Marcus. So I was teaching at one point in a computing school, and then I was teaching ethics in an engineering, a computing, telecommunications and electrical engineering school. And then now I'm in a business faculty. And with the more technologically oriented disciplines, when you're teaching either transdisciplinarity, or if you're teaching them a multidisciplinary view or a different perspective, we tend to teach it quite late in the process. We teach it, as I always say, as an afterthought. It is not necessarily integrated, it's a bolt-on. So you have ethics, let's design our systems, and let's do an ethical analysis, and we do that ethical analysis at the end. And we don't, I think, even come close to actively engaging in multidisciplinary efforts. It's just a bolt-on. It just seems like it's forced and it doesn't quite work. So I think academic institutions have a responsibility and a role to play, and it's going to be academia, industry, government, and as you framed, and I really like that framing, a complementary analysis of both sides. So those are my initial thoughts to your wonderful contributions, Marcus. Thank you.
Thank you, Roba, and thank you, Marcus. Do we have another question?
I think there's one in the chat, Eusebio, just the last one about children's rights.
Yeah, there is one that Marcus also posted, was asking also issues on elders' rights. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. I wholeheartedly agree. So I chose one example, and that was how we design for children. I've been involved in other projects where we looked at 3 to 5 year olds more specifically, and we were working on developing a gross motor skill development application to with children for children, which was quite a different model. In terms of looking at elders' rights, I am involved in one project around the socio-technical designs, mainly user-centered study markers of developing lower limb exoskeletons to enhance mobility, and that's done in a participatory manner. We haven't published any of the outcomes of that project yet, but what we're trying to do as part of that multidisciplinary project is to work on the methodologies for engagement with different groups, because even within, for example, we say children like it's a homogenous group, or it's just one group, or, children, let's design for children. We know that's not the case. Even within theoretically and methodologically speaking, when we're looking at the 3 to 5 year old bracket, there are significant differences with how we co-design with children in that age bracket when compared with, let's say, 9 to 11-year-olds. And the same goes for any age bracket. But I don't think we can look at, I think we need to look at rights in general, human rights. We need to look at children. We need to look at other groups and a range of use cases. And if I was to be completely transparent, ideally, it would be nice to, I guess, commission or be involved in a range of different multidisciplinary projects for different age brackets, for different groups, for individuals living with dementia, for example. That's an area I feel quite passionate about, for those living with neurocognitive and other conditions, for instance, and then try to see what theoretical, methodological insights can be derived from all of those to inform that public interest technology framework that I presented. And only then can we maybe derive some insights as to what works. But I'm in complete agreement. Definitely worth a closer look.
Thank you, Roba. And I'll tell you this, my 13-year-old daughter will agree with you that not all children are equal. We just participated a couple of weeks ago of the Verizon 5G Equity Jam, and Kata joined me as one of the judges for the innovations the students. And what was interesting was this interaction of the engineering students proposing innovations using 5G for her demographic, and she was looking and saying, now 13-year-olds thinks differently. So it's interesting to see, even because they were looking into that. I see that Toby has a question, and they would like to go ahead, Toby. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eusebio, and thank you, Dr. Abbas. It is just such a pleasure to hear you speak every time, and you have such a clarity and incisiveness into the way that you present these very complex concepts. But I feel at the heart of it, I feel under the surface of that, just fused with what you're talking about, this level of care and respect and humanness, and respect for the more than human also. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that that aspect of intense collaboration and maybe a precondition. Do you think that something like caring or respect is a precondition for that kind of collaboration, both between humans with the more than human world, but also perhaps with those aspects of technology which we are designing?
What a fabulous question, Toby. I can spend quite some time on that. And I know your own work touches on so many of these concepts, so please just jump in if you feel I've missed anything that you're researching as well. I think care, respect, and values in general are a necessary precondition to the design of any human-centered system that is oriented towards sustainability, as we define it, of human well-being and health, and environmental sustainability. So the short answer to that is yes. The question I have, or I guess the observations that I have and comments to your question, is whether we can actually develop care-centered platforms. And that's something that we're working on in the background in the context of individuals living with dementia, where we say the actual baked within the platform, the methodology, the design criteria, every facet of the system is this notion of care, and we've called it as such. So co-designing a care platform. I think in addition to care, concepts such as what you mentioned, respect for autonomy, respect for a range of different things is super important. And the challenge is how we actually formalize that as a methodology that will work in an industry setting. And that's always my concern and something I think about quite a lot. I think that it's great to talk about these concepts, and I love having these discussions with you, Toby, because I always go away thinking of more things to study and to research, and your own work actually inspires me to do that. Care and respect are crucial. All these ideas around values are super important, of governance, of regulatory frameworks, of all of those elements I mentioned. And there's much more. We're currently expanding that framework and building it in greater detail and trying to implement it. They're all really important. Something that concerns me and I find to be a challenge is how we actually introduce them into existing methodologies for design. And on that note, we are not just introducing care, respect, values into the design. We need to, I think you must have mentioned this in your presentation, to co-define. And I've been thinking about that process to how do we co-define what the values are that are of interest, but then how do we deal with competing interests? And that's something I didn't touch at all. Aside from the discussion of lived experience and professional expertise, interests are often conflicting, they're often incompatible, they're often driven by so many other things. So we can talk about care and values and respect unless we can integrate them into existing processes that then are implemented. My concern is that you'll always have technology developed in void of any human centricity, I guess. That's sort of a roundabout way to answer your question, but I think you're absolutely correct. Care and other values need to be a precondition for all of these processes. Implementation is another thing that requires really careful thought and deliberation as well. Thank you so much, Toby.
I think that
Go ahead, Toby.
is all right. That seems like such a key consideration, the complexity of values, conflicting values and interests, particularly I think as you talked about bringing in lived experience. We know that 2 or 5 people may each experience the same technological system or the same human event in different ways. How do we provide care for those differing perspectives? And it seems like when we're looking at operationalizing, when we're looking at building those technical systems, we want to create flows. You know, maybe it's a flow to report a problem or to get assistance for someone, whether that's someone living with dementia or someone who's experienced a harm online. And it's just not that simple. And so can our systems be complex enough to make space for all of that? Or is it some sort of hybrid? Anyway, if you have thoughts on those, I would love to hear it, but perhaps it is just a longer conversation and a deeper conversation.
Yeah, so many thoughts, Toby, and it is part of, I think, a much broader conversation. I think the reality is, while we're thinking about these large-scale systems, and we've had some discussions, some members of the team, and in a range of different contexts, in presentations I've been involved in, we talk at scale, all these large-scale systems, but realistically, I think something will have to happen at the local level with an understanding of complexity and connectedness and where we fit, and ensuring we're maintaining contextual integrity and all that kind of thing. But I think it happens at a micro level. So all the co-design processes that I've been involved in the implementation of, they're quite small scale projects. They have a lot of meaning, a lot of insights we can derive from those processes, from the development of an app for a child where you engage in, let's say, parent-child dyads, where you talk to educators, where you look at particular care centre models, or child care centre models, and what children think. It's so individualised. It's really micro scale. And to your point, I wonder how we design. I think it's a misplaced perception that you can design the entire system. You can't. You can conceptualize, you can try to understand, you can model, but you'll never model it completely accurately. You'll never be able to design. You're designing for a particular context in a particular setting. And if you are to incorporate lived experience, it's time consuming. There are a lot of challenges associated to it, back to Marcus's excellent points. And those challenges, I wish we had time to unpack them around the power dynamics within the co-design effort. So co-design, it sounds great in practice. Everyone talks co-design, but we talk about as well co-design as though it's this one process, and you just implement that process and you end up with a better outcome in terms of a system outcome or achievement of a system goal. That's not how it works in reality. What happens is that co-design can take on many configurations. As Eusebio provided an example of his daughter, that's one, a sample size of one, but tells us so much about some of the challenges that that emerge as part of these processes. And I've seen some of them firsthand. It's time consuming, it's resource intensive, it's difficult to analyze qualitative data and then merge that or reconcile it with quantitative data, because we take obviously quantitative data sets as being objective, they're fact, they tell us a lot, you know, the qualitative. And we all know from academia that that's not quite the case. There are always limitations and constraints and so on. So lots to unpack. I think we need to make room. Just a final point, say, is there room in these complex systems? I think it is our duty to make room for these processes and to push until, you know, something's got to give at some point. And to be honest, I've really appreciated Marcus's initial comment about complementarity and looking at the other side, because we can say, oh, this is a fabulous process. You know, look at this framework, it's going to solve all the world's problems and we're going to develop and design technology in the public interest. Or we can be authentic about it and say, look, this is the beginning of a framework. We'd like contributions. We'd like refinement of this framework. We'd like to collect more data to I guess, support additional iterations of this framework. But there are these challenges. We are working within these challenges. So we make a decision. Do we actually pursue co-design, or do we think about participation as well across a spectrum? So not every single, I guess, context or application area or design effort will require full-blown co-design. Some, I guess, contexts are just not suited. You might not be able to have access. You might not be able to engage with participants. And a prime example of that, I think, Toby, you were present at that PIT colloquium with Professor Kathy Treadaway, where she talks about individuals living with dementia and how to compassionately design. So compassionate design as a methodology. So I think it's going to be about drawing together all these ideas, all these different methodologies, collecting data to support the development, further development and iterations around this framework as a community, so not siloed, as a community, and trying to push for inter and transdisciplinary studies, knowing and being conscious of those challenges that exist, but still pursuing them because it's important, and our, you know, values, our health, our well-being, the environment is at stake here. So those are my comments, and lovely to chat to you. Thanks, Toby.
Thank you, Toby, and thank you, Roba. We have still a bit more time, so any other questions or comments? Well, if everyone is being shy, I'll have to jump in then. And Robo will tell you this, that the case of Chiara there was very interesting, because it was not only the sample of one, but how disconnect it was, the people developing the technology and the people that they were saying they were targeting. So I want you to ask your opinion on this. More and more I'm realizing that the distance between the designers and the users are getting farther and farther away. And one of the examples that allows me to visualize this, I think about, say, an engineer at Microsoft and an engineer at, let's say, a car manufacturing company or any business. Could be here a professor at university, you know. And you think about one is designing technology, the other one is using. But if you think about, most of the times they live in the same neighborhood. Maybe their kids go to the same school. And what you have is this kind of Weltanschauung, you know, view of the world that is relatively similar, even though they might be from different, but you know, the idea of this comes, you know, if you would ask the neighborhood I lived in, Maryland, you know, the kids there, do you know anyone who went to college? They'll tell you everybody went to college. And if I would go to some areas in Baltimore City and I ask, do you know anyone who has been incarcerated? They would have a much longer list than the people they would know that have been to college. So as technology becomes very pervasive, and the idea of co-design, but there is distances between the designers and the actual end user, especially when you think the public and who's the public. I love Katina, I love to ask that question. But how do you think we can address to try to find ways that that distance of not only of reality, but really of Weltanschauung, of views of the world, can be bridged as we're sharing the same technology. I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Sorry, it was a long question, but I think it was worth it.
Oh, it's a great question. I can hear you talk about that for ages, Eusebio, and we've had slightly similar discussions. So I'm going to attempt to answer as best as I can because there are so many points that I'd like to unpack there. I think the distance between designers and users has always been there, and there's also always been a siloing. So there's siloing from that perspective, the actual implementation of the co-design, how it happens in practice. You've got the siloing of disciplines that we spoke about before, another layer. You've also got academic institutions that are quite disparate. They work separately, in a separate manner when compared to government, compared to industry. So we don't only have a divide between a user and designer at the individual co-design level. There are these disparities and these gaps that exist across the board. Now, the question is, and it's a great one, how do we actually bridge this gap? And how do we, I'm trying to remember the terminology you used about deal with differences in perspective, in effect. I think that was, to paraphrase poorly there. Was that how it was phrased, Eusebio?
I used the German term, which is Weltanschauung, which is the view of the world, which normally you would use in philosophy.
Yeah.
MG sure. Michael would agree with me on that.
But you also spoke, you also spoke about perspectives, and you used a particular, I'm just trying to remember to talk about almost implying how we see each other's perspectives or how we reconcile. And I think that's part of the broader, I was more referring to that part of the broader discussion about respect that Toby discussed. So how do we encourage respectful engagements? But that doesn't give us much to work off in terms of how to implement and what you're talking about practically bridging that gap. I think realistically, one approach, and this is going to be a very defined view, Eusebio, sorry, because there's so much to it, and just in the interest of time, one particular approach will be to work within existing industry-based processes and to be respectful of those processes. And I've often thought of how would we engage in co-design if we are designing something, a technology, any technology with an industry focus. How do you encourage individuals in industry to adopt these co-design processes, given they're timely, they're costly, they're resource intensive, and so on? And I think part of that would be to work within their frame of reference. And we do have some published work in proceedings of the IEEE where we tried to do that in the context of co-designing a robotic capsule for endoscopy purposes. And we took existing engineering design and development processes, and we showed how we can integrate the co-design philosophy within the realm of that process. And I think that's a starting point to bridging the gap. The discussions around lived experience and professional expertise, I think, are going to take a lot more time, but as immediate steps, it might be working within existing processes. So not trying to, disregard the importance and value of the systems development lifecycle. Oh, that's rubbish. We're going to, provide our own cycle. To sort of say, we acknowledge that these are your processes. This is what you work within. But do you know, if you think about ethics, and you can integrate ethics as part of your requirements analysis, but much more than that, that you can infuse within the actual process, the idea of socio-technical co-design at all stages, but to do so in a tangible manner that results in something actionable, in some kind of outcome. So that's an immediate response. Discussions around the public and things like that, I think, require a bit more time.
No questions asked there. And Marcos also added a very interesting comment. And, being someone that grew up in Brazil, I'll tell you the difference between private and public schools are even, more. So when I mentioned that the idea is that in some areas in the US, or many areas here in the US, you have what I call gated communities. That, here in Arizona, there's a lot of gated communities, but in Maryland, they are gateless, but they are gated. There's no physical gates, but there are others that shows that kind of, live in silos and so forth. Thank you so much, Roba. So it's 4:31 here. I would like to thank you so much for this first talk, and I'll ask you to stay. The other participants, this is now we're going to pass to the 30 minutes of glory of our students that we'll have the opportunity to discuss with them, with Roba further to this. So I want to first thank you so much for how much you have given into this presentation, and the ideas that you share. They're extremely valuable, and I think it's an interesting discussion. And hopefully we can slowly break some silos and make this kind of approach more, especially now that we're going to be talking to students and so forth. There are very big challenges on academic careers and KPIs that are still based on silos or journals and other things like that, that this kind of approach seems difficult to understand or much harder to publish in some cases. So I want to thank everyone, and then